If you look at a list of all the teams that have ever won a championship in the NBA, you're going to see a lot of familiar names. You'll notice that the Warriors won the first championship ever in 1947, back when they were known as the Philadelphia Warriors. And you'll notice that the Lakers then won 5 of the next 7 championships, back when they were known as the Minneapolis Lakers. But what you might not notice is the peculiarity of who won the second NBA championship in 1948. Because the team that won, the Baltimore Bullets, no longer exists. As in, this team eventually died out and did not continue into the future. Other early champions like the Lakers and Warriors and Royals moved to new cities, but not the Bullets, because the Bullets ceased operations in 1954, which makes them something of an anomaly. Every Super Bowl winner still exists, and every World Series winner still exists, even if some of the franchises moved or changed names. But there is an NBA championship team that is simply defunct, that died out and is not represented by any team as of the recording of this video, anyway. Now, the reason that it is easy to overlook this fact is that there was another franchise in the NBA that was established that was called the Bullets, who did also play in Baltimore for a decade, and who were known as the Baltimore Bullets, before then becoming the Capitol Bullets, and then the Washington Bullets, and eventually the Washington Wizards, and so on. But that franchise, the Washington Wizards, is a completely different franchise from the original Bullets. They do not share the same lineage. They are totally different teams. In other words, if you ever see an infographic of NBA champions and you see a Washington Wizards logo next to the Bullets championship in 1948, that infographic is wrong because they are not the same team. They just happen to have the same name. And so, I thought it would be cool to go over the history of the original Baltimore Bullets, since there's no NBA team with a history like theirs, and yet their history is easy to forget because they withered away instead of continuing on, like every other champion. So, first, the Bullets were named, in part, after a very famous local munitions factory called the Old Baltimore Shot Tower, which existed to help make bullets. And here's what it looks like. This building was actually the tallest building in the entire United States when it was built in 1828. And the Bullets logo literally featured a speeding bullet having been shot towards a basketball, which is definitely something. Interestingly, the Bullets did not originate as an NBA team. They began play in 1944 as a member of the American Basketball League, which was a precursor to the NBA. And they played 3 seasons in the ABL. They went 14-16 in 1945. They won the ABL championship in 1946 with a 21-13 record. And then, in their final season in the ABL, they went 31-3 in 1947 and were so confident that they were going to be the champions because the ABL had begun to fall apart by this point, that when the ABL postseason began to drag on, the Bullets didn't wait for it to continue and decided to stop playing in it and just declare themselves the winners. And so, they essentially forfeited and allowed a different team called the Trenton Tigers to win the ABL title that year in their place, even though everyone knew that the Bullets were the best team that year. And so, the following year, the Bullets joined the Basketball Association of America, which later turned into the NBA, in what would eventually be considered the NBA's second season. And in their first season in the league, the Bullets defeated the Philadelphia Warriors in 1948 to become the second champion of the BAA/NBA. And the 1948 Bullets are maybe the most anonymous NBA champions ever, not only because the team later stopped existing, and not only because they only went 28-20 that year, but because they didn't even have a transcendent superstar the way that other early champions did. If you look at their roster, it had only one Hall of Famer on it as a player, and it was a man named Buddy Jeanette, who was also the coach of the team. And Buddy Jeanette was considered the best backcourt player in the world at the time. The world! And his NBA stats are putrid by today's standards. You couldn't get on a roster today with stats this bad. But 1948 was a different time in basketball. If you look at the stats of the 1948 Bullets, it's amazing because their highest scoring player, Cleggy Hermsen, averaged 12 points per game that year. By far the lowest scoring average of any NBA champion's leading regular season scorer ever. But everyone was bad back then. The 1948 Baltimore Bullets shot 30.1% from the field, and they were the best shooting team in the league that year. Players were not proficient at making shots in the beginning of the NBA's existence. Even George Mikan, who was the first legendary big man in the NBA's history, he was 6'10", and his career shooting percentage was 40.4%. Again, it was a very different game back then. The 1948 Bullets averaged 74.4 points per game, and that was actually an improvement from the previous year's champions, the 1947 Warriors, who won the first title ever in a season in which they averaged 68.6 points per game. And if you want another example of how much things have changed since 1948, here is a recount of what it was like for the Bullets to win the second NBA title ever from Paul Hoffman, who was one of the Bullets players back then. He told the Baltimore Sun in 1998, "Back then, most people felt if you played pro basketball, you weren't doing much with your life. We got a little over $2,000 a man from the playoffs. That was a great deal of money, considering I got $4,000 and a Mercury for signing that year. The players got pen and pencil sets, but Buddy Jeanette got a bonus for being our leader. The Gunther Brewery gave him a 10-inch TV for leading us to the title, and Buddy had a house full of guests all year long." A separate Baltimore Sun article from 1998 includes the incredible anecdote that Hoffman, who was the 1948 Rookie of the Year, had threatened to sit out part of the 1948 playoffs because his wife thought it was improper for him to be running around in public in shorts. There are a few other delightful anecdotes about the Bullets, including where they played, because they played in a converted trolley car barn called the Baltimore Coliseum that held roughly 4,000 people, and it was, by all accounts, not a fun place to play in. In Baltimore Sports, Stories from Charm City, the arena was described as, quote, "a drafty, dimly lit shell of a building that doubled as a roller skating rink." Frank DeFord, the renowned sports writer, once wrote of it, "The Baltimore Bullets played in a filthy little arena which dared to call itself the Coliseum. Old players told me that they tended to eschew showers there in order to avoid the manifold cat droppings." Paul Hoffman himself had once said of the stadium, quote, "We had only one shower and the cats made it their home." But the cat infestation might have replaced a rat infestation, because there were also stories of rats being everywhere in it. In Hoop Crazy, The Lives of Claire B. and Chip Hilton, Claire B., who later coached the Bullets, described his decision to do so as the biggest mistake of his life, saying they had a lousy place to play in, it was an old car barn that they converted into a gym, the rats were still inside. And that book then noted that the players, quote, often skipped post-game showers to avoid stepping on rat droppings. Robert Embry, who was once part owner of the Bullets, said of the Coliseum, "It was a real dump. You could only get 4,000 in it if you stood them in all the corners." But again, the Bullets were champions of the NBA in their very first season in it. And despite how dominant they had been in the twilight years of the ABL, when that league was falling apart, one could reasonably argue that the 1948 Bullets are the most improbable champions in the history of the NBA. And it was all downhill from there. No NBA team ever has or ever will peak as epically as the Bullets did, because they not only never had another winning season after their first one, they had a worse winning percentage in every subsequent season. And in the 1953-54 season, their final full season, they went 16-56 and were the worst team in the league. By this point, the Bullets were hemorrhaging money and setting the stage for the last time that an NBA franchise would ever fold. In 1953, a once revered college basketball coach named Claire B had signed on with a man named Lou Rosenbush to become the owners of the Bullets, as well as its coach in B's case. But by 1954, the team was in such horrible financial shape that Rosenbush decided that he wanted out, which led to Claire B buying him out and becoming the sole owner of the team. But this was a problem because, by his own admission, B was very bad with money and quickly began to realize that he had placed himself in a disastrous situation. He said he bought Rosenbush's shares because, quote, "they were broke and owed me a lot of money. So they told me I could buy the team for a few bucks, and I did. But then I kept pouring my money in, and the next year things got no better, and I knew if I could save anything I had, I must get out." The more he soured on the team, the more erratic his behavior became. B flippantly changed his team's uniforms 3 times in a single year, and often skipped out on even coaching the team at all. Paul Hoffman said of him, "Claire was anything but stable. He was drinking heavily. It's sad, he's a legend, but to us, he was anything but a coach. He didn't coach, didn't manage, wasn't around the club at all. We were on our own, and we just got our butts beat." Things did not improve. The Bullets started off the 1954-55 season with another terrible record, but their financial situation was the real catastrophe. Even after Claire B had handed ownership of the team over to someone else, the franchise was heading towards bankruptcy. And B was so unsuited for the situation that the team was now in that early in the season, he abandoned the team and fled to his farm and left the organization at someone else's mercy instead of having to be around it anymore. And he never went back to the team. He said at the time, quote, "Until the ownership situation is cleared up, I have taken a leave of absence which can be extended indefinitely or considered as a resignation, depending entirely on the wishes of the owners, old and new." The NBA could no longer tolerate the Bullet situation and gave them a deadline to find new owners who could handle all the debt that the organization had accumulated. But none arose. And so, in late November of 1954, with the team's record sitting at 3-11, the NBA and the Bullets ownership reached an agreement to disband the franchise, which canceled all of their remaining games. It also led to something called a dispersal draft, in which the other NBA teams were allowed to draft players off the Bullets roster in the middle of the season. So for instance, Frank Selvey, who was an all-star that year and started it out in Baltimore, was drafted in the middle of the season by the Milwaukee Hawks, who he finished the season with. And the same thing happened with a few of their other players. But some Bullets players were not so lucky and had their careers immediately end the moment that the Bullets stopped playing. What's interesting is that the dispersal draft could have been temporary. It was reported that the NBA's agreement with the Bullets was to only definitively shut them down for a year, with the carve-out that if the Bullets were able to find new owners, the team could come back the following season. And if they did, all the players in the dispersal draft who had found new homes would then revert back to being on the Bullets, which would have been very unusual. But needless to say, that never transpired. The Bullets never came back. And what's even weirder is that the 14 games that the Bullets played in the 1954-55 season officially never happened. The NBA struck those games from the record. And so everything that happened in them, all the results, all the scoring, everything that their opponents did in them, etc., does not count in the NBA's official records. And that's why, if you look up the Baltimore Bullets season-by-season results in an official NBA source, you will not see their 3-11 record counted. Officially, the Bullets' final game was at the end of the 1953-54 regular season. And so, the Bullets faded into nothingness. But regional NBA fans didn't need to wait long to get a team again, because in 1961, a new team was formed in the NBA called the Chicago Packers. The Packers then changed their name to the Chicago Zephyrs, and only 1 year after that, in 1963, they moved to Baltimore and became the second NBA team to call themselves the Baltimore Bullets. So, all's well that ends well, right? Except that by getting a new team with the same name as the old team that was not a continuation of the old team because they'd spent 2 years in Chicago first, the new Baltimore Bullets more or less erased the old Baltimore Bullets from people's consciousness. Even though the original Bullets won a championship, they won it in the NBA's infancy, when the NBA was not remotely prestigious, when it wasn't even called the NBA. When the Bullets won in 1948, they didn't even get a trophy from the league, or rings. And so, by the time the new Bullets had etched themselves into NBA history with a title of their own in 1978, it had become easy to forget that the original Bullets were ever a thing. But they were a thing, and I think it's cool to remember them. The 1948 Baltimore Bullets are an historical outlier. They won with a roster that doesn't remotely connote a championship roster. They won when very few people were paying attention to the league, and because they're divorced from any active franchise, there's not much of a reason for anyone to ever reminisce about them. But that in itself is notable. The 1948 Baltimore Bullets are the NBA champions that time forgot. They had so little of a following that less than a decade later, they literally had to go out of business, a thing that has never happened to any NBA franchise since. But that doesn't change the fact that they still won a title. And so, as easy as it might be to overlook the 1948 Baltimore Bullets, you also can't tell the complete story of the NBA without them.